All right, so we have been in Matthew 5. If we can slow the clock down, we may finish Matthew 5 today. It just depends on how many questions and comments you have throughout, I guess, right? But I wanted to go back just a little bit. Oh, there it goes. He wants to step backwards. How can we move forward when we're stepping back, right? But I've come across Beatitudes According to the World by J.B. Phillips. J.B. Phillips was one who gave us one of the first, how do I describe it? It's not a translation, it's not a transliteration, it's really kind of like the Message, the Message version of the Bible. It's one of those kind of paraphrased, without the sarcasm, kind of paraphrased version of the Bible. He gave us one of the first versions of those, at least in the common time. But he also put out this neat little quip. And this is Beatitudes. We've gone through the Beatitudes per Jesus. Now contrast this with what Phillips writes about Beatitudes according to the world. Happy are the pushers, for they get on in the world. Happy are the hard-boiled, for they never let life hurt them. Happy are those who complain, for they get their own way in the end. Happy are the blasé, for they never worry over their sins. Happy are the slave drivers, for they get results. Happy are the knowledgeable men of the world, for they know their way around. And happy are the troublemakers, for people have to take notice of them. Now, we laugh because there's a lot of that's true in our culture, of the world around us. But it emphasizes how different God has called us to be. How different Jesus is saying, if you want to be my disciple, you have to look and be different. And as we pursued through the last little bit where we're talking about clarifications of the law, it's not about action, it's about heart. Actions will follow wherever your heart leads you. So he says, let's take it back to the heart of the matter. And that's where we're going. When he says, remember, all of this comes from right before that transition zone where he says, your righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And that was kind of a shocking statement to those at the time. But then he goes on to describe, it's not the activity, it's not the doing of the law, it's not the checklist salvation perspective that some people at that time carried and some people at this time carry. Okay? It's not about the checklist, it's about the heart. It's about the heart of the law and what leads to, eventually, the checklist. So when we talked about murder, thou shalt not murder, we went back and we said it's not necessarily the doing, it's what leads to the doing. It's the attitude and the heart and the actions that build up over time that culminate and result in the action of murder. And Jesus says, don't even start. If you notice yourself on the path, back up, get off. And then we went on to adultery. And we talked about the same lesson. It's bad to be in the bedroom. But it's not about that. It's about what starts before that. It's about really that heart or the lustful eyes that gets you on that path to start with. And when you notice that you're on that path, dig your eye out, cut your hand off, not literally, but basically do whatever it takes to get yourself out of that situation so that you're never going to find yourself in the bedroom with someone else. And then he adds on to that divorce. And this is something I really didn't notice. I'll say I didn't notice it. He doesn't use the exact same formula with the divorce thing. And that leads me to think that it was kind of an add-on to the adultery conversation. Okay? And so he talks about divorce and how the culture of the time and the legal oral tradition of the time had placed divorce in a different legal context. There were all of these loopholes that were offered by the oral tradition and the oral law and the various rabbis that taught at the time, where one could get themselves out of marriage legally according to the law. And Jesus has to put that right and say, look, God allows divorce, and he's talking to those people. He allowed this idea of a certificate of divorce because of the hardness of your heart. But if you really think about it, Jesus says, go back to the beginning. It wasn't designed that way. So if we really want to get back to what God wants, let's go all the way to creation. Let's not worry about what the law says, and because they had twisted the law. Okay, they had twisted the words of Moses and the decree of Moses and the allowances that God gave through Moses to mean something that God never intended in the first place. And so he added that onto that conversation about adultery. But now we're in another verse, and I would have said this is the fourth of 6, but it may actually be the third of 5, depending on where you place that divorce section. Okay, so he's going through this section, clarifications on the heart of the law, and he's going through and he's giving these little vignettes about things that they might have heard in their teachings of the day. Things that they might have understood to be true based on what the rabbis taught or based on what the world around them was teaching them. And they all in some way have a connection to the law. Now, they all do not fully come from the law, because there are some articulations in what we're going to see today that aren't given in the law. So it has stretched and it has pulled and it has changed over time. And so Jesus is saying, let's get back to the root of it. Okay? And so we're going to start Matthew chapter 5, verse 33. Verse 33 starts a section, a little vignette about oaths. Has anyone ever made a promise? Sure. Has anyone ever broken a promise? Never. I think we all have. There is a human tendency to do that. Now, sometimes it's a promise that we regret later. We're like, oh, I wish I hadn't have done that, because now I put myself under an obligation that I don't want to be on anymore. And sometimes we just excuse ourselves and find an excuse to get ourselves out of it, right? And then other times it's just human forgetfulness or incapacity. We aren't able to follow through on what we said we were going to do. And then sometimes we're dedicated to it, we hold to it, and by golly, we push through and we fulfill on the promise we make. God knows that we're like that. God knows that we're like that. Did you know that God never asks us to make an oath in the law? And yet, oaths were this big thing back then. Not only oaths to God, promises to God, but also oaths and promises to each other. And so the whole idea of an oath, well, you know what, let me just read through it first, and then we'll go back to the idea of an oath. Here's what he says, and this word again is what brought me to the idea that divorce was actually an add-on to the adultery section, because now he's saying, okay, getting back to the topic, again, he says, you have heard it said to people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it's God's throne, or by earth, for it's his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. Do not swear by your head, for you can't count even one hair, white or black. You can't even make one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. And some versions say, let your yes be yes, or let your yes, yes, let your no, no. Mean what you say, he says. Anything beyond that comes from the evil one. So let's think about oaths. Today, have you ever heard the phrase, I swear on my mother's grave? You have, yeah. When we were all kids, we were, cross your heart, hope to die. Why do we swear on something bigger, on something different? Why do we think that's important? Makes it more authentic.
Or you want something to happen, and you're willing to try to convince the other person of your sincerity.
Absolutely. It makes it more authentic, and it communicates to the other party that you're serious about it. This is the way oaths worked back then. When you made an oath to someone else, you made a promise, or you made even a contract, a covenant of some kind, you would make that covenant and substantiate it with usually a deity. What that was about was there is a witness that corroborates the contract. There was a witness that was going to act even as collateral for the follow-through on that commitment, that vow. And so you would say, I swear, or I have an oath based on, usually a deity, but it didn't have to be, God, that I'm going to do this, this, and this. And that affirms for the parties that you're dead serious about this. And you're going to follow through. Jonathan.
It also puts your life on the line. It's what you're really saying, that I will die rather than not do this. So in Proverbs 6, it talks about that. If you strip in your hand with a string, if you're surety for your friend, deliver yourself as a roe from the hand of the hunter. You basically put your life at risk when you've done that. So that's why Jesus said, don't do that. And here it exhorts you, go to your friend and say, look, I'm sorry, I did that under duress, or forgive me, I can't do this. So go and communicate that you can't do it, or try to gain some humanity, compassion for your friend when you've done this in duress, or
okay.
Lie or whatever. So
I think there's some
death that could happen.
I think there's definitely something to that. But I will say, let's go back even before Proverbs. Let's go all the way back to Exodus 20. Anyone knows what's in Exodus 20? The Ten Commandments. Let's go back to the Ten Commandments and let's see what it has to say. Let's go to verse 4. No, I'm sorry. Let me back up. Figure out where this is. 7. Exodus 20, verse 7. You shall not misuse, and this is the NIV version, and sometimes I don't like it as well, but sometimes I like it a lot. So this one, I'm not used to this wording. But you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Do you mind reading that from your version?
Yeah, New American Standard. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain.
Okay. Now, so often we think about this verse in the context of swear words. I'm getting some head shakes. But let's go back further. The root of this is don't swear on the name of God and then not follow through with it, because what you've just done is made the name of God valueless. Okay? You have just communicated that my God has no value because he did not compel me to follow through. I am not committed to him because I didn't follow through. He says, don't make my name vain. Don't make it common. Why? Name is the essence. Name is the being. So that's the root. Okay. Now, let's go a couple other places. Let's take you to Leviticus 19. Leviticus 19 is talking about our oaths with other people, our promises to other people. And here's what God has to say there in verse 12. He says, do not swear falsely by my name and so profane the name of your God. Wait a minute, we just talked about that, right? Okay. God's serious about this. I am the Lord, he says. Okay. Another one, Deuteronomy 5:11. We're going to hop around just a little bit, and don't feel like you have to jump there. Deuteronomy 5:11, very similar. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. That's a repeat of those 10 commandments. Okay? Don't misuse the name of God. Don't make a vow in the name of God when you're not going to keep it. Okay? Now, that's using it in the context of an agreement with others. There's another way to use it. Making a vow to God. Okay? So let's go to a couple where God says, if you make a vow to me, I don't ask you to, I don't make you make a vow to me, but if you choose to make a vow to me, Numbers 30. Numbers 30, and we're going to verse 2. And this is a very interesting chapter. We're not going to read through it, but there are some legal nuances, especially related to women who make vows or daughters who make vows, and whether or not that vow is is to be upheld based on whether the father or the husband agrees with it. It's a very interesting chapter. But we're going to look at just chapter 2, or verse 2. When a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath to obligate himself by a pledge, he must not break his word, but do everything he said. Okay, this is God's perspective. You make an oath to me, you make a promise to me. I don't tell you to. I don't even necessarily ask you to, but if you choose to, you keep it. This is God's perspective. Another one, Deuteronomy 23 and 23:21. If you make a vow to the Lord your God, do not be slow to pay it, for the Lord your God will certainly demand it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. So if you're slow to pay it, if you don't follow through with that vow, you will be guilty of sin, he says. But if you refrain from making a vow, if you don't do it, you won't be guilty. Whatever your lips utter, you must be sure to do, because you made your vow freely to the Lord your God with your own mouth. He said, you chose to do it. You chose to do it, you follow through on it. So that's the context. And okay, we're going to do it just because I really want to clear the air on some of this. Has anyone heard of the man named Jephthah? Jephthah. Okay. Jephthah. Go ahead. Okay, you're like, I'm going to... Okay. We see Jephthah in the book of Judges. Jephthah was that one that was asked to lead the war. And remember, he said, he made a vow to God. And he said, God, if you will help me win this battle, I will sacrifice to you the first thing that comes out of my house. Do you remember that? It was his daughter. Yes, we're talking about Judges chapter 11. Judges chapter 11. And there's really there's a couple reasons I want to go here. One, because it's about oaths to God. Judges chapter 11, Jephthah made an oath. And Jephthah was serious about this oath. And he knew that he could not break this oath. Okay, he knew the law of God. And so he really committed to following through on this oath. And God helped him. God did his part. And now, let's see. Let's go with Jephthah, verse 30. Judges 11, verse 30. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, if you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. So he defeats the Ammonites. He comes home. I don't know what Jephthah expected to come out his door. Okay? Could have been he expected the household lamb. I don't know. It does say out the door. And so when he gets home, who was the first one to come out the door? His daughter. Now, there are lots of people who take this and make it say that Jephthah sacrificed his daughter in a burnt offering. I don't believe that. There are a couple practical reasons I don't believe that, and there's a spiritual reason I don't believe that. One, God does not want that kind of offering. He never asks us to sacrifice another human being. He hates it. Okay? So that's the spiritual thing. I don't think God would require that. And I don't think that's what Jephthah intended when he says sacrifice, when he follows through with he does follow through with his vow. But watch what happens. She comes out, he's in tears, verse 35. When he saw her, he tore his clothes. Oh no, my daughter, you have brought me down, and I am devastated. I have made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break. And she understood. She understood vows. She understood vows to the Lord, and that they were unbreakable. My father, she replied, you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me just as you promised. Now that the Lord has avenged you and your enemies, the Amorites. Here's why I think practically this didn't happen the way a lot of people say it happened. Grant me this one request. Give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends, because I will never marry. Okay? It's an odd request if one is going to die. Take 2 months to mourn the fact that you will always be a virgin if you think you're going to die. Okay? Practically, I think that's an interesting nuance that would lead us away from the traditional thought there. Also, it says, verse 39. After the 2 months, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he vowed, and she was a virgin. Here's what I think happened. Does anyone remember a boy named Samuel? Okay? Samuel was the result of a vow made to God by his mother as a sacrifice for letting her have a child. Okay? The sacrifice was, he was to be committed to the Lord. He was to serve the Lord for his entire life. In his case, we know that he actually served under a priest. We don't know how this happened with Jephthah's daughter, but I believe the case here is the sacrifice that was made was she was given up to serve the Lord in some capacity, and we know there were some capacities early on in the days of the tabernacle where women did take part. We could go there, but we don't need to take the time today. So I think that's the sacrifice that's being made. It's not a true burnt offering. It is because it's a human being, because it's his daughter, she is being given up in a different way. It was a huge sacrifice. One, because he had no sons. And so now his only daughter, his whole lineage was cut off. He had no one to carry on his family name or any part of the property. Okay? So that's a huge sacrifice. I think that's the nuance here. But I really wanted to bring that because I wanted to clear that story. I wanted to kind of get you thinking that there might not be the traditional thinking. But also, this is precisely the point. You made a vow, he made a vow, he followed through on it. He didn't make an excuse. Now, we get all the way to Jesus' time, and what we see is that the rabbis of the day, the teachers of the law of the day, would find loopholes in vows. In fact, they would go so far, for instance, to say, let me actually... Yeah. Let me read to you from the Talmud. The Talmud is a writing on the oral law, or it is part of the oral law, but it is also part of the commentary on the oral law. There are some nuances between the Mishnah and the Talmud. But this is from the Talmud. If anyone swear by heaven, by earth, by the sun, etc., although the mind of the swearer be under these words to swear by him who created them, in other words, even though the essence of the of swearing by the heavens is really talking about the one who created the heavens, it is not an oath. If you swear by one of the prophets or some book of the scriptures, although the swearer be the sense of the swearer be to swear by him who sent the prophet or that gave the book, nevertheless, this is not an oath. Here's what they were doing. They were not using the name of God. They were replacing the name of God with an idea of God. I swear by the heavens and the earth. Well, they didn't use the name of God. So guess what? You can get out of the oath. You're not committed. And then it got even so nuanced and constructive, you could swear by Jerusalem and get out of the oath. But if you swore toward Jerusalem, you're under oath. Talk about making it tough. Okay? So let's get back to what Jesus said, Matthew 5. Jesus says, don't swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for you know what? God's in heaven, that's his throne. Or on earth. God created earth, God is on earth in spirit, that's his footstool. Or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. Don't do it. Do not swear by your head. They would do that too. I swear on the hairs of my head. Okay? Don't swear on your head. All you need to do is say yes or no. And you know what? He's saying it's the heart. It's the heart. Because if you swear on this other stuff, what you're doing is you're creating a loophole. You're purposefully creating a loophole to get yourself out of it. You want to have a righteousness greater than the Pharisees? You want to have a righteousness greater than the teachers of the law? Starts at the heart. Jim.
Yeah, in our society, it seems like in the court of law, place your hand on the Bible.
I'm glad you said that. Because there's that question. What about taking an oath in court? Place your right hand on the, repeat after me. And there's a really, 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 really big deal right now about swearing on the Quran. Okay? Islamic scriptures. Yep, the Quran. Really big deal right now. But if we follow what Jesus said, I've even heard it said, you could swear on a comic book. Because it's not about what you swear on. It's about the promise in your heart.
Don't Jesus' words you just read here look to what it will be like in heaven for us? Without a sin nature, the inhabitants of heaven don't swear on anything.
No need to.
If I tell you something, you believe it because there's no lie in me. And the same when you tell me something.
Can you imagine what that's going to be like?
We have no human experience to relate to having no sin nature.
Absolute trust in what anyone says. Wow. Pretty cool.
It used to be all you had to do is have a handshake with a man, and that was
That's right.
as good as...
That's right. But today you try to walk into a car dealer and say, I want that car, I like that car. Let's shake on it and give me the keys. They're not going to do it, are they? Whoa. But you're right. There's an old gentleman's agreement. Your word was your word. It was binding.
The neighbor that was
There you go. And you know what? This goes back to where we started in Exodus 20. It's because of the name. You know, families used to be very concerned about the name of the family. And when their kids acted up, they got onto them because you're smearing in the name of the Johnson family, or, you know, you're making us look bad. And so, in the same sense, God's saying, don't make me look bad. You had something?
Well, there's a verse of Scripture, I don't know exactly where it is. It says, that the Lord puts no confidence in his saints. So that speaks to us that as we're made to be partakers in the divine nature, over time, as you grow in your maturity and evidence that you are partaking in the divine nature, we have hope to come to a place of integrity before the Lord and with each other. And so, as you grow in that, more is expected of you, I think, from the Lord to conduct yourself that way. But we do have a hope to be transformed, to be more like Christ in these things. And so we don't have to continue to call ourselves the sinner that we were. We might be the sinner we are today, but it's not necessarily the sin we were yesterday, because there should be some growth and change and transformation. As we partake of the divine nature, we come into a place of greater ability to live as Christians.
I think that's true.
God still puts no confidence in us in and of ourselves, but it's the Spirit He's placed within us that He places His confidence in.
Okay, I can agree with that. He knows humanity. He knows our propensities to sin. But at the same time, He knows His Spirit, and those who allow His Spirit to work within us and to develop us, to grow us, then over time, our practices and our behavior become more like Him, and we grow more like Him. And so, you know, a perpetual liar is not going to read this, hear this from Jesus and go, oh, ding, my life has changed. But they know the direction. They say, okay, I'm going to commit to making that a behavior in my life. And so when something like this occurs, like, that's right, I wasn't supposed to do that. And it shapes them over time. And so I think it's a good point. We have to, I don't want to say excuse ourselves, allow ourselves, but we do have to recognize that humanity develops. My spirit, my alignment with God develops over time. And so we pray towards that. We surround ourselves with people that help us in that endeavor. And then, yeah, absolutely. Good thought there. Okay, we're not going to make it through all three, but let's go to the next one. Eye for an eye. You knew that, didn't you? You fully expected that. He did. He made a commitment. Now, I would almost guarantee, and the point was Zacchaeus seemed to make a more immediate turn. And I think Zacchaeus had a propensity already to make that turn because he was interested in seeing this Jesus. So he had probably already had some thoughts as to what does this mean? How does this play out in my own life? What does this look like? And when Jesus did the approach, now, that's not saying that Jesus couldn't have rammed the Spirit into Zacchaeus to make changes. Okay, he could do whatever he wants. But it seems that Zacchaeus made a quicker change. But it doesn't really tell us his story. It doesn't tell us how long it took him to correct the behavior. But it does imply that that change was made. It was made fairly promptly. Eye for an eye, verse 38 of Matthew 5. You have heard it said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. If anyone wants to sue you, take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. There is a tendency in me and you and all humanity to take vengeance. When someone injures you in some way, Could be physically, could be emotionally. You want to fight back. You want to get back. You want to get even. And sometimes we want to go farther than getting even. Sometimes people do. Absolutely.
That's Godship.
Say again?
Godship.
Godship.
Yeah, you put yourself in God's
In God's place. Yes, you're saying, I'm God, I can take vengeance on my own. Absolutely. We'll talk a little bit about that, I think, maybe. Hopefully we get there. Go ahead.
I found that God's vengeance is so far superior to mine that I'm stepping back and letting Him do.
Right. And we see examples of that in the Bible throughout. And there is, I taught a sermon one time on David, and the story where Abigail and her husband, the fool, I think Nabal was his name, David wanted to take vengeance for himself. But Abigail, smart Abigail, said, whoa, that's not yours to do. Let God manage it. And so, even David had to be corrected and reminded that that's so true.
But you got to guard your heart that you don't want it. If you want the vengeance, you might need to check yourself.
Right, and we're getting there. That's exactly where Jesus is taking us. Yeah.
A clear conscience is priceless.
It is. It is. Hard to have, though. Here's the issue. Let's go back to Exodus 21. Exodus 21:22 is where God lays down a law, and He says, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Okay? So Exodus 21, verse 22. If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman, and she gives birth prematurely, or one might say has a miscarriage, right? Okay. But there's no serious injury, so I guess in that case there wouldn't be a miscarriage. The offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury to the woman, meaning if there's mortality to the woman or to the infant, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Okay? This is what God's laying down. Now, a lot of people go, whew, that sounds like an angry, bitter, vengeful God. What if I told you it's not? Hang in there. That was the law. That was the judicial law. Now, it wasn't a principle where a person could, on his own, enact that. That was a judicial law, so that when the court system of the day decided this is the penalty, this is what happened, it directed the penalty that was in like fashion to what happened, what occurred. That law was called the lex talionis. Lex talionis. And it's actually not only seen in Hebrew Scripture. It's seen throughout a lot of the ancient world. But here's the issue. Lex talionis actually means, if I can find it in my notes right quick, I think I've already got, the law of retaliation. And it says one thing. It says, let the retaliation, let the penalty fit the crime. But it also says, don't let the penalty exceed the crime. So the idea of this was, yes, be just in your penalties. But yes, be just in your penalties. Just do the penalty. Don't go beyond. You hit me and knocked out my tooth, you're going to wear uppers the rest of your life.
Well, there is a saying, it's when you look around, cover that.
Right, it does. It does. Or you accidentally ran over my wife. Okay? I'm going to go kill your wife, not only your wife, your children, and your brothers and sisters. Because, by golly, I want vengeance. The lex talionis says that doesn't happen. It stops that. So it is not necessarily a vengeful law, a mad, wrathful law. It is a law of freedom. It says you can't exceed the crime. That's exactly right. And we see that in several places. Vengeance is the Lord. It's the Lord's. Let's see.
Remember too, when they're at the mountain and they were trembling, and God said, "Don't even touch the mountain, or you'll be stoned or thrust through." We're kind of fortunate that God came down in the person of Jesus. For that reason, He's meek and mild, and given us time to consider our way and repent and be transformed and take on His Spirit, so that He wouldn't say things like He said to Moses, "Well, let me alone that I may consume 2 million people in a moment and make you a great nation." I mean, we can't fully know how God feels about His offense at being called a liar in the Garden of Eden. And that is something we're just glad to have Jesus to come and have grace and truth, minister to us. So we don't have to try to go there. We can just deal with Jesus, what He's saying.
Yep.
Pretty fortunate.
Very fortunate. Absolutely. So what Jesus is getting at is this idea of lex talionis. And the Jews were committed to that. Okay, they were very precise about that. But here's where Jesus says, exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. Exceed the teachers of the law. Here's how. And then he goes on to say, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, if anyone sues you, if anyone asks you to go 1 mile, if anyone asks any money or a loan from you. Now, there's a little bit about the culture of the day. Remember, we're under Roman rule. And there are some nuances under Roman rule that the Roman citizens, especially the Roman soldiers, were allowed to do a number of things and not bear consequences for those things. But those things often brought anger, bitterness, and retaliatory thoughts to the mind. One of the things that was fairly common was this idea of the slap. Now, we're not talking this kind of slap. Okay? Which cheek does it say? Right cheek. Most people are right-handed. That's left hand, or that's a left cheek. It's a backhanded slap. Now, we're not saying the backhanded slap doesn't hurt, but what's intended is it's an insult. If you're slapped with the backhand, you're insulted. That's what's intended with that kind of a slap in that day. Okay? And so Jesus is saying, if you're insulted, turn the other cheek. He's not saying, oh, that felt good, do the other side. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, no retaliatory feelings. De-escalate the issue. Okay? So if someone insults you, don't give it back. Turn the other cheek.
You might consider yourself worthy of it for a moment. Just pray and say, "Lord, was I in the wrong?"
I think it's very possible. It's possible to be in the wrong and to be thoughtful about it. But I don't.
Rather than answer back with violence, you overcome you with good. So you might consider, well, maybe I did speak well. The guy was upset, and I'm the Christian. I should be the one to pray.
There is a nuance there. I don't think that's necessarily what God is speaking to, but there is definitely a nuance there. That it's how that's one of the measures that we can use to play out the scenario. Absolutely. So don't bear the insult. Don't return the insult. Okay? Don't escalate. When possible, de-escalate. Okay? Now, I will also say, That's very hard to do. Absolutely hard to do. And you know what? It's even harder to do when it's not to me, it's to my daughter.
It hurts you more than her.
Quite possibly. Yeah. That's really hard to do. You know, there are a lot of dads who go to jail because someone did something to their daughter. Okay? God says don't do that. Okay? Now, there is a whole book. Leo Tolstoy wrote a whole book about how we shouldn't have military, we shouldn't have police, we shouldn't have a judicial system. Because the whole idea of that is we are resisting the enemy. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what that world would look like if we didn't have that? But this is the philosophy that some people draw from that verse. That's not what he's saying. He's talking about the human heart.
The world you have is the book of Judges.
Say again?
The world you would have is the book of Judges.
Very much the book of Judges. Yes, absolutely. Now, striking the cheek was one. But if one demands your shirt, give him your coat also. The coat that he's talking about was one that in the law you had every right to keep overnight. What you would do is you would give a coat to someone as collateral, but they were required to give it back to you each night because it was that coat that was a blanket that kept you warm. And we could go to the verse, but we don't have time. But that's the idea. It is rightly yours. But Jesus is saying, hey, if someone sews the breeches off of you, give them everything. Even what is rightfully yours. Have that kind of heart.